Osrith turned and used the power in her legs to throw herself at Warmond, but the momentum had not been enough for Warmond to release young Finan, and the huge man turned, towering over Osrith. "I will wring his neck," Warmond told her. "After I have killed you, whore." The man raised his foot aiming for her head, and Osrith closed her eyes. "My son," she thought, "I love him." There was no impact. Finan had pulled her, holding on to Osrith tightly as she struggled to reach their son, who was being crushed at the throat by Warmond. But not for long, and young Finan was thrown to the hard summer floor as a volley of thrusts with sword and dagger came at him. Utad was fighting Warmond and was giving no ground, striking his face and neck, and landing a stab from the dagger in his left hand into the man's upper arm. And Osrith really thought he was going to be the victor, her brother, attacking the man who had been attacking his nephew. Utad rained down blow after blow on the giant man. But somehow, it was making little difference, and worse, as everyone watched this single combat, Utad was growing tired. His arm was lower and he was slower. Warmond struck out with his hand, and Utad was on his back, and the man was dragging him around the clearing. Osrith could not watch. Pulling young Finan to her, she buried her head into Finan's shoulder, pressing herself to him, flinching at every thump and cry. "Elaine," Finan soothed, and after what seemed like hours, the thumping came less and less frequently. "I will take the pretender," Warmond exclaimed, and Osrith turned to see the man stalking over to them. Behind her, she heard the shrrrm of weapons being unsheathed. The mercenaries had other ideas, and within a few seconds, Ethelhelm's men were sword to Muriel's, and on the losing side. "We will find you," Warmond growled as he called off his men, some of them dead, many of them having been forced back into the river, and stuck his finger point out to young Finan. "Edward's bastard." But before anyone could reply, the man was stamping through the middle as if it were a stream, calling his men to him. Finan, pulling Osrith towards him, kissed her forehead before pulling young Finan in two. "Thank God you're safe," he told her. Thank God you are safe." Then he broke away, and nodded towards Utad, lying in a crumpled heap on the ground just before them. "I need to," he began, and Osrith nodded, adding a yes, when he paused. Then she realized young Finan was staring at her. "Edward's bastard," he repeated. Finan turned, and looked between his wife and his son. "You haven't told him?" she scolded Finan. He crossed back to them. "Not when it's not true," he told her, "and I told ye." Utad had a plan, and then turned and strode towards Utad, who was still down. A woman was kneeling beside him, long black hair falling on either side of her shoulders. Osrith turned to young Finan, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Finan Beeg," Osrith began, laying a hand on her son's shoulder. "There might be just a small, tiny rumor that you are the son of the dead King Edward." And there was a pause so long that it felt like a chasm between two precipices. And then, young Finan laughed. Osrith stared. If she was expecting anything, she was not expecting that. "I agree with that, her son told her, and he stepped to Osrith and gave her a hug, like he used to when he was a child, all close to her neck with arms tight about her neck. "Thank you for trying to rescue me." They watched as Finan knelt, tenderly, beside her brother. He had fought Warmond to protect her, Osrith knew, intervened when she was about to die. And young Finan had called him, at her, she knew, Finan, not Constantine. There was a plan. And when the mercenaries came to her, Elfkin, Egelfrith and Oshir and Falkbald, they waited with her, with young Finan to find out what that plan was. "You did not kill him, Lord," Finan said softly, to Utad. Neither of them thought that he would get up again, but with the help of them both, himself and Benedetta, the former slave girl who had taken a shine to Utad, he was on his feet. He would be sharing it, and by all the gods, none of them would interfere again. 88,888,888. It was simple. Or rather, it was straightforward. That did not mean it was by any means safe or might not go wrong at any point. The mercenaries, beside their captain, waited for Utad to speak. And he told them it all. Mercia, of course, was for the plan. Osrith, however, shivered. She had, and Utad more than had, paid for young Finan's life. Putting him back into danger was not at all what she wanted. He is 14 years old, Finan told her. I was a warrior at that age. Training to be one, Osrith replied. She thought of Dubkan, the Morma's son, who was all mouth and little skill. If Osrith had been fighting him for real when he was 14, Dubkan would have been dead by now. And he learned very little at Bibbenberg, so I am given to understand. He learned enough, Finan told her. And he's not 14 until December, Osrith told him. She knew she was onto a loser. His father, his uncle would be beside him. Utad would never have let himself get pulverized if young Finan was not dear to him. At least she would be there. You will not, Utad told her, and when she opened her mouth to protest, he added, you heard how dangerous it is going to be. I cannot spare men to defend you. You won't be, I will be defending myself. Utad glanced to Finan, who gave Utad the same look back, and he crossed to her, and put his arm around her, walking her away from her brother and Eswi and Delfkin. If you will not do it for your men, your Mercen warriors, if you will not do it for your ally from Alba, and here, Osrith knew, he meant Eswi, will you do it for me? Trust me, was what her husband was asking her to do. I will do it for you, Osrith told Finan, and to her own surprise, knew that she meant it. Eswi would take her back to Alba, and Osrith had agreed to that too, though how he meant to do that, being as they were in the middle of East Anglia, she didn't know. So she watched young Finan dress in Mercen livery, and her heart beat faster as the time neared for them to leave. The children whom Utad had rescued and any slaves who wished it were going to be taken back to Bibbenberg, and Eswi suggested she went with them. No, Osrith told Eswi, I am not a person who my brother has rescued. But you are not intending to abandon me and chase after them, are you? Eswi asked. Osrith shook her head. She'd given Finan her word that she would meet them in Berwick, and in Berwick she was going to be. Somehow Berg was going to take Sparrowhawk and the children, and the Mercens, with Utad, would march southwest and meet up with Aethelestan. Young Finan was going to be a Mercen, and serve under Aldhelm's command, thus keeping him away from any plots against his life, or ransom attempts, or using him as a third candidate for the Wessex and Mercen thrones. He was her son, hers and Finan's, and that was how it was going to stay. The West Saxons are inside and are closing the city, was the news that Eswi had brought. Like hell they are, Miral exclaimed, Fay Isley. Lundin is Mercen, Aethelestan is Mercen. And with such fighting talk, with such men as Elfkin and her old company around young Finan, he could not go wrong. Although she hated that her son was going because of her own inability to keep her legs closed for Edward on the day she had brought the plea for troops at Titenholg, if she had to choose men for him to go with, Utad and Finan, and her Mercens would be those men. Keep your blade high and your mouth closed, Osrith said in Gaelish to her son just before they left. Why? Young Finan asked, as he kissed his mother's sake. She took his hands in hers. Because, my son, I love you more than words can say, but if you open your mouth you sound like a Gael, and they will know about Ethelhelm's plot with Constantine and they'll run you through without any questions being asked. Into his hand she pressed Sainidstjan, in its holder, with its strap. You knew him, Osrith told her son, before he could protest. You loved him, as I loved him. I want to know something if Alba goes with you. For young Finan was to stand beside Aethelestan, when he won, and make his elegance known. If Aethelestan harmed him in any way, Osrith thought ferociously, she would find him and she would kill him. And you will be the Trojans, she added. Her son smiled and shook his head. You've got it wrong, Finan told his mother. The West Saxons are the Trojans and we are the Greeks. And Utad was the horse, Osrith thought, the trap that he would be pulling off, to upset the whole lot of the West Saxons to make Aethelstan king, of both Mercia and Wessex. And then she turned, because she knew if she didn't, she would stride back out with them to Lundin. 88,888,888. We will follow the river down to the estuary, Eswi said, walking beside her. It's a good thing you did letting your son go with his father. Osrith nodded, but could not bring herself to say anything for some while. As they neared the flatter part of the land, Eswe pointed to the shore. "We have silver enough to get you back to Beric." "I have silver," Osrith told him, "and I wish—" She broke off. What she wished was irrelevant, and she changed the subject. "Is Lundin taken with West Saxons?" "It appears so," Eswe told her. "Lundin has already been taken." And a day later they got to the coast to see her transport back north. It was flying the white banner with the red hand of the Allied. There, at the prow, was Sin, the captain of Domhnall's ship, Constantine's flagship. "Did you know it was going to be here?" Osrith asked. Eswe smiled. "Only before I left Lundin," he told her, and smiled at her astonishment. "Domhnall's men refused to go home without you." Which is when she heard that there were more reinforcements moving into Lundin. Aethelstan and his men were going to be seriously outnumbered. "I couldn't stop you," Eswe told her, when they were both aboard. Eswe, who knew everyone in Alba, or so it seemed, shaking Sin's hand energetically. "Your reputation for impetuosity is well known," he added. "My reputation?" Osrith asked. Did she even have a reputation? "Oh yes," Eswe told her. "You fight with all your heart, with great skill and daring. You play to your own rules, though you listen to advice, all the advice. And should there be a change in the field of battle you adapt to it. Men follow you because you inspire loyalty in them. And occasionally, just occasionally you disobey direct instructions, and if it is bound to an oath, you stretch its agreed conditions to the limit." Osrith stared at him, and then glanced around the crew of the Trinity. "How long have you known that I would head west?" she asked him. "Almost as soon as we left. These proud men are Pictish, and have been trained at Dunnottar under Sainid." So Sainid had never left her, Osrith thought. And what's more, her first thoughts had been the right ones. In the Trinity were red liveries, with the Stag of Wilt and Sir embroidered onto it, like the one she had abandoned when the guard had fathomed she could not be West Saxon. "How far north on the river is still Wessex?" Osrith asked. Because when Aethelstan claimed victory she wanted to stand before him and swear she never entered Mercia. It was only when the ship was underway, however, that Osrith asked Eswe one more question. "And how long was it before you two knew I would go west?" Eswe smiled at her again, as if she was a student who had just worked out the answer to a complicated puzzle which, indeed, she had. "He always knew, Osrith," he told her. "He always knew." 88,888,888. The smell from the city hit them almost as soon as the banks of the river narrowed to become the liminal boundary that separated sea from river. Sailing upstream, the Picts had begun to help the ship by at first rowing a pair of men and then rowing more pairs. Cloth and scummy filth drifted by them, and a dead dog. They were in Lundin all right, and the first thing Aethelstan should do when he takes the city, Osrith thought, was to sort out the water supply. The Trinity slowed when they got to the junction with the Thames and the river fleet. In that river an army sat, waiting on traders who were coming up. Ethelm's men, in red, had stopped the merchant in front of them and a guard was busy inspecting what looked like barrels of fish, herring or mackerel, that were stored within them. The guard waved them through, and then it was the turn of the Trinity. Osrith watched as Eswe took up the negotiations, and an almost imperceptible change of coin purse from her friend to the guard took place. They were through, and into the mercantile area of the city. "Billing," Eswe told Osrith. "He is the man who controls the trade here." "A West Saxon?" "Ethelm's man." "His own man," Eswe told her. "We trade Uisjbetha down here, and return with all manner of things, furs, cloth, jewels, medicine, herbs and spices. Meat that can keep." It made sense. A lot of trade was done in Lundin, and the cloth that was used in Dunnottar and sewn by Ealasaid and her troop of maids had to come from somewhere. "We are traders, or at least I and Sin are traders. You may go to do as you wish." He handed her a purse of silver. Before Osrith could wave it away, Eswe pressed it into her hand. "You may have need of it, better to have it and not need it," he added. So there were two horses, Osrith thought, as she stepped down onto Billingsgate, in the uniform of a West Saxon warrior again. Or was there only her? If that was the case, and Uhtred had guessed she would come to Lundin in any case. "Wait for me," she told Eswe, and then repeated this to Sin. "Wait for me, so I may return to Beric." For she was no oath breaker, and Finan and their son were going to come home. 88,888,888. It did not take long to find a company. Men were coming out of a hall at the eastern bank of the river. A captain was calling them in. "Hampton, here," the man called, looking with sharp eyes at the recruits. "Winchester, here, and over here." Men who had been brought as reinforcements were being sorted into companies, and Osrith joined the Hampton men. Aldorta thought had crossed her mind that, as Constantine had been aiding Ethelm, she should have said, "Alba." They were here to defend the gate at the north, and would join the other men in sections on the old Roman wall. They were to look for mercenaries. With them were several bowmen, bows hewn from ash trees and strung with horsegut bound with tree bark fibers. They were there to be marksmen. Osrith shuddered as she thought of young Finan being the target of one of these archers. What to do would become apparent when there was actually an attack. Her son had told her that it was once said that the supreme art of war was to subdue the enemy without actually engaging men in battle. It was clear that Ethelm was subscribing to that school of thought. It would be difficult, impossible, even, to break the Roman walls until Ethelm, on behalf of his nephew Elf, the second son of Edward, for his claim. "There has been sickness in the north," the commander shouted at the Hampton company. "Has there been any ships in your port from Eothwick?" "Eothwick," Osrith mused, as they marched to the walls, and she hoped that as far north as Bibbenberg, where Eutyd's Sparrowhawk was heading, and Berwick, where Trinity would eventually take her, had been untouched. There was Dunham, technically Eutyd's, but between there and her own lands sparse populations dwelt. And they waited, and they gamed and told stories and polished weapons and waited. The gates were barred. Wessex, under Ethelm's men, had control of the city. Unless Osrith could throw them an advantage, Mercia would have to attack barred gates and the loss of life would be heavy. 88,888,888. And the day after Osrith found the advantage for Mercia. She and 3 other men had been sent to watch for the mercenaries and those in East Anglia loyal to Aethelstan. It was a tiresome job, not least because there really was nothing to look at except for the heads of the West Saxon warriors below. One of the guards in her company leaned over the balustrade and pissed on another West Saxon below. Osrith moved out of the way in time, in case she was seen, and handed the blame. Until the morning. Early in the morning, as the sun was rising and a flock of geese sped overhead towards the south, men were coming from the north. "They're coming, the bastards!" Held, one of the other Hampton guards exclaimed. "Didn't take long to climb out of their holes." And Osrith thought, a year ago, they were your allies, your comrades. A decade, and you were fighting side by side, cheek by cheek. Now, down there were Eutyd and Finan and her mercenaries, and her son would be there somewhere, fodder for the bowmen in the ramparts. A noise began to grow, starting low, a murmur, a rumble of voices and feet pounding the dry earth outside the city. As more companies, led by more commanders in green and yellow, drew nearer, it got louder, a thumping of legs and spear shafts. From her position near the top of the rampart, close to the mechanism of the gate, Osrith peered down, looking for the impossible, looking for her kin. And then the fighting began. West Saxons who had lined the ramparts had begun to hurl stones and rocks down onto the mercenary warriors as they in turn began to hack at the gate. 2 West Saxons were having a competition as to how many mercenaries they could hit, a common pastime, but that afternoon it touched Osrith's raw soul, and she punched one of them in the mouth. "Good one," the other man said, with a laugh. I was getting tired of hearing him speak. He turned to aim back down into the mercenaries now, but Osrith hit him too, thumping him in the jaw. He lost balance, and tumbled back, spilling his arrows and bow, which Osrith threw outside the walls, down into Ethelstan's warriors, down into the street. A tussle had begun, as a mercenary helped by 2 more, had scaled the stonework, and had made it to the palisade level. He was doing well, Osrith thought, as he helped up 2 of his colleagues, but then one toppled back when he was hit by a spear haft, and another fell down shortly afterwards. The north gate was closed, and it was holding. So she needed to do something. Behind the rampart, Osrith collected more arrows that had fallen and thrown them over the side as well, as she ran towards the rope that held the gate on one side. She needed to cut the rope, which would make one side weak. "Hey!" a voice called behind Osrith, but she wasn't turning. "Hey!" and feet followed her. At the junction of the rampart and the gear housing for the gate rope, Osrith chanced look behind her. Two men were running after her, one with an arm raised. "Hey you killed Ekir in East Anglia," he cried, then turned to the other man. "I knew he wasn't from Hampton." One tried to grab at her ankle as she scaled the wall, but she managed to kick him in the face, but the other had got hold of her calf, and was pulling her down. Osrith struggled, but it was little use, and she was now down, and she skidded on the wooden wall. The man said nothing, but instead held up his right arm to deliver the killing blow. But it never fell. The mercenaries had their own bowman, and the man was a good target when he had raised his sword. His eyes glazed over and he fell back. Osrith skittered on the wood, and got her balance, then began to climb again. But then another, firmer hand, gripped Osrith, and this time brought her down hard on the deck. She was ready, this time, and flew to the man's legs, trying to tackle him, but instead missed and fell at the man's feet. The blow did not come, but a hand did. "It's me, Lady Osrith," came the voice. She looked up into the face of a man she knew. There was only one person who called her lady when in truth, his father had been the king.